the other thing which I would not advise students to do, and this is general advice. This is not the case for everybody. I won't say this is something that I don't think anybody learning Chinese should do, but I spent a majority of my time when I was studying on my own learning to handwrite characters. And um, nowadays, I don't recommend people spend too much time doing that because it's not learning Chinese is you do that why so that you can communicate. And so if you are here, you don't know any Chinese and you want to learn to communicate, there's so many things you need to do to get to here, which is where you can communicate. You can listen quite well, you know enough vocabulary and grammar, and you're practiced enough with it, you can speak a lot. Going from here to here is like an enormously long task, and being able to handwrite characters is not really on that direct path. So is it fun? Absolutely. I love doing it. That's why I spent so much time doing it. But since then, I haven't used it at all. Whereas all the other skills, reading, speaking, listening, writing, all that sort of stuff, or typing pinyin anyway, is those are the skills that you actually use all the time outside of the classroom. Whereas for me, handwriting was like this fun thing that I did when I was studying, and that was it. Like I never really had a chance to use it outside of that. Nobody ever says, "Oh, hey, can you like write me a note?" And you're like gonna write it, handwrite it or whatever. Um, so yeah, that was one of the things that I think I wouldn't have done again. I probably spent 500 hours in that year handwriting characters, and I've lost most of it because I haven't used it now in 10 years. Whereas all the other skills, reading, writing, listening, all of those continue to go up because I use them. They're expected of you. They're necessary in modern life. Whereas the handwriting for me anyway was not um, something that was particularly useful afterwards.
So for students that are interested in learning Chinese or are studying Chinese now, how much time should they spend on learning to write by hand? Because like one school of thought that I've heard of is just like skip it completely. Everyone uses pinyin. Everyone's using like texting. There may be the odd chance where you're at some place in China and someone asks you to write something, but so that's one end of the spectrum. Others really believe it's like if you want to learn the language, you should learn that as well. So for you, what do you think is the right amount of time to allocate towards learning to write by hand?
It depends what your goal is. If your goal is you want to maximize how well you can communicate in the smallest amount of time, uh, very little of that of your time should be spent towards learning to handwrite because it's not really going to help you be a better communicator. If I had, you know, put it this way, if you had somebody who knew no Chinese at all and you told them in 24 hours somebody is, a Chinese person is going to come here and they don't speak any English, and you are going to want to be able to communicate with him as much as possible. You have 24 hours to spend that time as you will. Will you learn some words, learn how to speak some words, learn how to listen to some things, learn a few phrases? Hello, how are you? Or will you spend that time learning to handwrite some of those characters? I don't think I would spend any of that time learning how to handwrite those characters just because it doesn't necessarily help you. Having said that, it is certainly, if you're super interested in Chinese, if you're super interested in the language, the culture, all that sort of stuff, it's super fun, super fascinating. It can help you remember some characters for sure, but it takes an enormous amount of time for a very little amount of communication payoff. I do know some people who are excellent at writing and they keep journals for themselves, and I think that's awesome. And that's incredible if they're able to do that. I'm sure that's very helpful for their studies. It's probably very useful. I don't think everybody has that amount of time, and most people are interested in speaking. And if you're interested in speaking, I think that most of the time will be better spent listening, speaking, reading, and really treat handwriting characters as kind of like an art form, or an elective on the side. Um, Even people who say you shouldn't spend any time learning characters, a lot of them say you should learn about 100 or so. I can agree with that. I think that you'll what's the Pareto rule? Something like 80-20. If you spend 20 hours learning how to write 50 or 100 characters, you will gain a strong appreciation. You certainly won't know how to write almost anything at that point, but you'll gain a very strong appreciation, big impact for the amount of time that you spent, for kind of how characters are created, and you'll be able to look at them a little bit differently. But after that, I'm not sure it's the best use of the average student's time.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because this is one of the things I've been trying to think about a little bit as well. So when I took my first two university classes, huge emphasis on writing Chinese.
Mm.
We get these character sheets. You have to like repeat the stroke order for each character one by one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then I found that if I don't do it for like a month or two, it's like totally out. Like if someone asks me to write it, I won't know how to do it. I can re-remember it, but it's pretty hard. So the what I settled on is I have a new teacher now. She insists on some writing, so I do it. But I would say it's probably like 10 to maybe 10% of my time
Hmm.
spent learning. Um, okay, so that's pretty interesting. So okay,
I
so you're in
think
China now. Oh, go for it.
I think what you said is interesting though. It's you could spend a lot of time doing it, but then outside of the classroom environment, it's not really used. I mean, I can even quiz some of my Chinese friends how do you spell 羡慕, which is like to envy, and they're or not how to spell it, but how to handwrite it, and they're all like, oh, of course I can do it. And then a lot of them start writing it. If you're not studying Chinese, if you're listening to this podcast, that's a particularly complicated Chinese character with lots of strokes, and of course they think, of course they can definitely write that, and then they go to write it, and more than half the time they're like, oh, I don't quite remember how to do it. And it's like, yeah, because you don't really do that day to day. You type in pinyin if you want to create characters or whatever. And so yeah, why put that extra burden on a student who already has so many disadvantages going into this language? So
Interesting. Okay.